Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is mixing color. For oil painting, this is exceptionally important. So a big mistake that a lot of beginner painters might make when they go into the art store and they're trying to buy paint and everything is that they see the huge variety and they think what colors are going to be in my composition and uh, try to get the colors that are the closest to the colors that they plan to use. So that's a huge mistake. You don't want to do that. Instead, what you want to do is never ever paint directly from the tube. What that means is that instead of saying this is the color I need and so I'll buy that color and paint from that, uh, you want to say, well, how can I mix paint to get that color? Why do you want to do it? Why do you want to mix? Because when you mix to get the color, you actually don't need as much different colored paints. So, for example, if you just use the three primary colors, which consists of three tubes of paint, you can get any color. So, since there's a huge range of colors, I think some brands have up to 250 different colors. Rather than buy 250 tubes of paint, some of which can cost, you know, $40 for 40 milliliters, uh, it's better to just buy three tubes of 40 milliliters for maybe as much as $40. This could be 14 to 40. And then you just mix it in the correct proportions to get the color that you want. And then you don't need to have as much paint sitting around. Also, the other side thing about that is that there's certain colors that you will never use, and then you'd have this $40 tube of paint that you never even touch. So that's a waste. So anyway, you want to mix. Now let's talk about mixing color. A huge mistake that I've also seen when it comes to people mixing colors is this, is that they have this idea. And ultimately what you want to do is you want to buy your primary color paints and then you also want to get white. Why do you want to do that? Well, uh, because white lightens the color. You can actually make black from the three primary colors. Okay, so you'll have black then. Okay, but you can't mix paint to get white. So white in that sense would be considered primary, but it's not one of the primary colors because it's considered colorless. But anyway, you take the three primary colors, which is red, yellow, and blue, because we're talking about paint, we're not talking about light, and you will mix them to get every other color. Well, what colors do you get? Some people will open a book. Here's another mistake. You open a book, you look at a bunch of things that people have said about colors. They talk about AI, things like the color wheel, stuff like that. None of that is true. Okay, I'm not saying that the color wheel isn't true. What I'm saying is that it suggests things that are not true. So rather than think, for example, that hey, well, according to the color wheel, if I take red and yellow and mix it, I'll get orange. Well, what shade of orange? Are you going to get a medium orange? If you take blue and yellow, are you just going to get, color grass, green, or are you going to get some shade of green? Uh, you know, it actually makes a huge difference which blue are you using, which yellow are you using, which red are you using, because in any different brand there's different, there's a whole variety of reds, blues, and yellows. So you're going to have to hunt that a little while after you've decided what brand you're going to use, and you're going to have to figure out which red you want to use and which, uh, I eventually moved over to a magenta for my reds. And then, which blue and which yellow you want to use from that brand. Now, I use Old Holland Classic for reasons that have to do with the way that particular brand is processed. But, you may use a different brand. You may not use oil paint even. You might use acrylic. You might use something else. So that all makes a huge difference. Also, the other thing is it's very important to understand is that a particular red from a particular brand might not be the same exact red as it was the year before or the next year to come. And they actually change each year because the the manufacturing process that these companies use to produce these colors. So that's worth knowing too. But ultimately, what you come down to is that you don't know anything about color until you've done a color study. Well, what's a color study? Color study is when you take these primary colors that I've already mentioned, and you go ahead and you mix them together. Now, do a little one-to-one. You take we're just doing a color study. We're not trying to paint a painting. We don't need a whole lot of color here. So take take a very small little, take your color, take your painting knife and just scrape just a little small smidge of paint, maybe as big as the end of this pen, onto the color, and I put it down and do the same thing with the other color. Let's just use these little tiny micro amounts of color because we don't want to waste this expensive paint. So take those two colors, put them together, and mix them up real well and see what you get. Okay. Now you're going to end up somewhere between the two original colors that you started with. Now, depending on how things go and with that brand and everything else, like I mentioned, you may end up toward the middle of the spectrum or closer to one of the originating poles that you started with, because you might have a dominant color. I mean, for example, another thing that's important to know is that there are transparent paints, which are referred to as lakes, semi-transparent paints, and then there's also opaque paints, which cover. So all that makes a huge difference too. So for this study, we really want to use opaque paints. We don't want to have anything that's translucent. I mean, obviously, you would need a whole lot more translucent yellow with your opaque blue than you would need an opaque yellow with an opaque blue. Okay. So go ahead and mix your yellow and your blue together and see what shade of green, if at all, you get. You may get a turquoise. Okay, you could have a very dominant blue, and you could end up way further over in the blue than you thought you'd be. So once you've done that, go ahead and take that mixture and mix it again with one of the poles until you fill out the whole spectrum from your 50-50 mix down to this pole and then down to this pole, one step at a time. You know, like if it's a little on the blue side, go ahead and take that and move it 50-50-50 until you get it all the way to the blue side. What we're looking for is what's called in psychology the J&D. J&D stands for just noticeable difference, and you want to see just noticeable differences between actual blue unmixed to one step up to one step up to one step up to wherever the 50-50 is, to one step to wherever the yellow is. Okay, and you want that way when you're looking for, I need this particular shade of yellow or this particular shade of blue or this particular shade of green, you know exactly where to find it. Okay, go ahead and do that with your oranges using your red and yellow, and go ahead and do that with your purples using your red and blues. Now you've got basically what in color theory books would be referred to as the color wheel, and you'll find that to produce the color wheel was nothing like what these color books would have suggested. Okay, so that's a very important lesson for you to learn. Again, like I said, because of the annual differences in manufacturing, you know, you should be aware of the fact that it's going to be a variable, which means that it will be different from every year. So you don't have to redo the test every year, but you'll learn so much doing it the first time that you'll know when you're doing your painting that you're ballparking how many steps it's going to take for you to get to the actual target hue. That's how you're going to get it. When you see that color and you don't know a name for that color, but you see it and you're trying to match that color, this is how you're going to do it. Now we're going to go into something else. What happens when you're not dealing with a secondary color? You're dealing with a color that you know is it's not a regular blue, it's not an orange, purple, or green. You're dealing with yet a different color. Okay, so for example, what happens if you take one of these oranges, you know, whether it be the middle orange or one of the you know redder oranges or yellower oranges, and then you mix that with blue, and you know varying blue. You know, you could have it. You can mix it with the blue itself, or with some shade of green, for example, or you can mix it with blue itself or some shade of purple, for example. That's going to make a huge difference. Okay, so do those color studies too. So go ahead and take the orange, one of the shades of orange, and bring blue into that, and do it the same way. Step it in. So what I use is a color pyramid, and I'll try to get you a visual graphic on that to go along with this video. And it shows you how to not only do a two-dimensional color study, but actually what you'll end up with is a three-dimensional color study, where you take any one of these secondary colors and move it into its complementary color. And you're doing the same exact step-by-step thing. First you do the 50-50, and you find out wherever the actual mid-mark is, and then you move it to the J&D to this pole, the J&D to this pole, and you find out, you know, how many steps it took you from the 50-50 mix to actually get halfway between this color and that color. Usually, the way I would identify that half color is when you find the color that least resembles any one of the originating colors, whether it be a secondary color or a primary, doesn't matter. So that's how I recommend it. As I said before, there is a tremendous amount of mixing here for color sampling involved in this process. You do not want to take a bunch of color, squirt out a big huge mess onto your palette, and then slowly in some very non-controlled manner mix it in. like they do on all these painting videos, which is just idiotic. You know, I think when I see these painting videos, they must just want you to waste your money and supplies because they're making money off you buying more painting and supplies. You don't need that much paint when you're painting that you need to waste a whole tube of paint, for example. Once you've squirted out of the tube, it's out. You can't put it back in. You can be like, okay, well, I use it. Okay, whatever's left on my palette is trash. And by the way, if you're dealing with oil paints, you know, it's not just an easy matter of washing it down the drain. Hope you know that. So basically, if you're dealing with oil paints and you have something left on your palette at the end of your painting session because maybe you got exhausted or whatever, you had to stop, or you just got done doing what you're doing for that day, you're going to need to clean off that palette, and then you're going to need to, like, you know, get all that up with some kind of rag or something, and you're going to need to throw that rag out. So that's trash. So just keep that in mind when you're spending large amounts of money on paint, and how you use it is going to determine whether or not you're spending your money wisely. So hope that helps you understand color a little bit better.